Welcome to the Reflections session at TRT World Forum 2021. I'm Elif Bereketli, anchor of TRT World's flagship arts and culture program Showcase. I hope you have been enjoying the forum so far. This year's title is Power and Paradox, Understanding Grand Strategy in the 21st Century. Now, we'll take the power and paradox discussion further with this next session called The Chinese Art Market on the Rise. About 20 years ago, China accounted for about 1% of global art sales. It was the early 2010s when China, after a sudden boom, displaced the UK and the US as the world's leading art market. Today, the sharp upturn in figures may have cooled off, but China's energetic and young art market continues to stimulate interest around the globe. Expert predictions on China's future are varied. Some expect to see more growth. Some say China's best days may already be gone. To discuss these and more, it is my pleasure to introduce our panel. Xiaoming Zhang is the founder of W.Ming Art. She is an independent international advisor serving leading auction houses around the world, as well as art market research centers. Eugene Wang is the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Professor of Asian Art at Harvard University. He is also the founding director of Harvard Chem Lab, exploring the nexus of cognition, art, and media. And H.G. Masters is the deputy editor and deputy publisher at ArtAsiaPacific magazine in Hong Kong. He's also the writer of numerous catalog essays about leading modern and contemporary artists. A warm welcome to you all. Now, Xiaoming, if I can begin with you. I just mentioned the sudden boom in China's art market in early 2010s, mid-2000s perhaps, when it displaced the UK and the US as the world's leading art market. Take us back to those days. Tell us, why did we see a boom in China's art market back then?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. And I'm speaking to all of you from Chengdu. And also, it's a great pleasure to be with such distinguished panelists, especially Professor Eugene Wang from Harvard University, and also a new colleague from Hong Kong. And I started working in the art market back in 2005. And at that time, Hong Kong Sotheby's and Christie's started sales on Chinese contemporary art or Asian modern and contemporary art. And we see great records were making nonstop through the sales from 2004. And when I joined the Sotheby's in 2005 to start Chinese art department and also to construct the sales on Asian modern and contemporary sales, we had a major focus on Chinese contemporary art. In 2006, we had a first sale in New York on Asian modern and contemporary art with a focus on Chinese contemporary art. And that time, and I was giving a target to make the sale total about $5 million US. And however, that sale was a huge success. And it was a sale rate at 97%. And we made world records for Zhang Xiaogang, Ai Weiwei, many artists. And I think that time we see a sudden boom on the international stage with that historical sale. And suddenly we see a boom also in Asia. And the contemporary is a concept that then from the market to the academic world. In the past, in the domestic market in China, they call the contemporary sale as 现代, which is modern sale. And when we had a contemporary sale in New York with a great success, and the academic world suddenly had attention to look at what is contemporary and what is contemporary art, especially in China. So that was the very beginning. And that boom started from 2004 and lasted to 2008. And in 2008, we see the financial crisis, and our market moved to Asia. So Asia, from Hong Kong to Beijing, and those were the two dominant markets for the Asian modern and contemporary art.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this summary. We'll definitely come back to some of the points you just made here. But I want to turn to Eugene now. Beyond all these figures that we've been talking about, the art market figures, do you think there was a larger story behind this boom? I mean, a storyline about perhaps how China positioned itself globally back then?
Yeah, I think how the market behave sometimes actually has a close correlation to the kind of expectation the world has of China. In other words, if we look at this in a larger picture, China since the 80s enter a reform era, and prior to that, it was pretty much a closed door China, and since that there was this stance of openness, and with that there's a great of curiosity about what's the China story, and the better way to convey that China story is through art, because art is a visual language that doesn't need a linguistic barrier, that can actually overcome linguistic barrier. So the worldwide attention to China has this expectation that is there any way we can understand China through art. And in the meantime, I think some milestone exhibitions, curated shows would project some kind of master narrative. And those master narrative will create certain kind of canon. And that canon is peopled by a set of artists whose signature works or works were considered some kind of milestone, so that people can structure their understanding of contemporary China by way of this set of milestones. So that's essentially the kind of large story. And then, of course, once China entered the WTO with the economy booming and all that, naturally that curiosity about China increases. And yes, so to answer your question, the upshot of it is to say that, yes, there is a storyline, and the storyline is very important. It largely conditions the people's interest and also make them decide what kind of artist that will better represent that story.
Okay, of course, this is not a one-way road here, because we see a lot of Chinese collectors buying Western art as well. So it will be interesting to hear what you think about it, maybe later throughout the panel, because I want to turn to HG now. When you think about this boom happening, as we talked about, early 2010s and mid 2000s. Do you also link it to this era, the reform era, if you may, that happened in the 1980s?
Well, I think at this point, for people who are scholars and curators of Chinese contemporary art, their roots really lie in the 1980s in terms of their education and their formative years. So we can say that Chinese contemporary art really comes out of certain schools and certain scenes that are all part of the opening up of China in the 1980s. And that just creates a generation of artists by the 1990s who are accompanied by curators. For example, Ho Han-ru, who's an internationally recognized curator today, who runs the Maxi Museum in Rome. I mean, he comes up at the same time as this generation of artists from the 1980s who then begin participating in major events like the Venice Biennale in 1993 and subsequent editions. Sai Guo-Chan wins the ultimate prize at the 1999 Venice Biennale, the Golden Lion. So China comes onto the world stage, contemporary art world stage anyway, of course, like almost in parallel with its economic rise and all of these cultural movements. So it's important to connect and realize that this generation started out domestically and really evolved from a set of very important communities, whether they were independent or attached to different art schools in China.
Okay. I want to turn back to a point Xiaoming made about the 2008 economic crisis. How much do you think was it linked to this boom that happened, if you may, HG?
I think it's important just to say that the art market in general is subject to all kinds of booms and speculations and fads and trends. And of course, looking at the early 2000s, mid 2000s, yeah, China was new. It was territory that people like, who were in the established art centers didn't necessarily know that much about. And suddenly you have this new market, and markets do what markets do, which is they expand rapidly. They try to find new buyers. They try to bring out new money. And is it all great? Of course not. Like, is there speculation? Like, yes, of course there was speculation. Were there a lot of people rushing into the market at one point? Yeah. But like I said earlier, like you actually had a very strong foundation of artists, artist groups, and then curators who had already independently of them of the market already emerged onto the international art scene in the 1990s. So by the time the art market, such as it is, catches up to these players, like they represent a whole generation, a whole nation's economy, this whole post-cultural revolution society, really. So booms are a thing, and they happen in the Chinese art market in the same way they do in all the other art markets of the world. But I think now that we're more than 12 or 15 years after the initial boom, we're seeing that these same artists of the 90s generation, someone like Zhang Xiaogang, for example, I mean, he's still achieving record prices for his paintings at auctions in Hong Kong. So it's really sort of overcome this idea that there was a kind of speculative boom that wasn't really rooted in something real. So I think 15 years later, we can say that those may have been good investments, and that this initial impetus was something really rooted in a very strong cultural legacy and heritage.
Okay, well, of course, the art market, to an extent, is always shaped by speculation. But I want to turn to Eugene now. Do you think, I mean, HG has just made his point, but do you think the growth has been based on a bubble?
Well, bubble is a strong word. I'm sure there is some kind of adjustment because as I said, a lot of it depends on the kind of storyline that the academics and the art world and critic circles circulate. So the storyline that initially fascinated the world about what the China is, what happened since 1980s, and also that's whole storyline that encompass people like Zhang Xiaogang and these other eminent artists now faces a new challenge, which is that what is the storyline now entering 21st century, especially the past 10 years or so. The world has changed a lot, and people have known China better, and also what is the new turnaround in terms of the narrative account of what's going on in art and in China. So I think there's some kind of need for a new master narrative to come around so that people can look for more, quote unquote, more contemporary Chinese art. And what I can gather is that the generation shift is very, very strongly felt. And by now, the 80s generation, the 90s generation, kind of slightly, they still hold ground well, I think, in the market. But in terms of the academic interest and in terms of critical interest, I think there's a sense of somehow things are moving on a bit. How that impact the art markets, that's not my specialty. I'm more interested in how how the new generation of artists will come on the scene and how the world receive them, and how the readjustment can be made. And to that extent, then a lot of moving parts are in play. And certainly I'm not in a position to predict whether it's a bubble or not. But one thing is certain that there are new challenges, especially also our sense of art has changed quite a bit because the new technology coming along and the kind of easel painting that once held ground in the 80s, what they still do as well. I'm sure they will still do well among the collector circles. How are they going to perform in the biennales and all that, and what that kind of performance would impact the art market is a different story. I'm sure my colleagues here will have a better sense.
Okay, before we move on, you mentioned the generational shift. Can you please talk us through what that means for you?
Yeah, that was very clearly registered in some of those graduation thesis exhibition I saw in Central Academy of Fine Arts and other art schools. What I felt, I was rather struck by how relatively less striking some of these traditional medium are, but then you will see that the digital generation, the digital natives do very well in the new medium, in videos and other digital formats. So you clearly sense that that's the sort of generation shift I'm talking about. You know, embracing some of the new medium. And by now, you know, Chinese artists have critical practice, artistic practice, pretty much on the sync with the rest of the world in mastering the medium. So then you have sense that the younger generation, they don't do as well in oil painting and all that. I mean, they still produce those, but they're not terribly, frankly, not terribly interesting. But the more interesting part tend to come from how they kind of mix conceptual art with medium, lens-based, time-based kind of art format, and that tend to, and also incorporating some of the ecological elements and all that. So that will produce a kind of art that you wouldn't imagine the 1980s generation to produce. It's simply a different world and different background and different ways of growing up and different exposure the artists would have. So you could clearly tell that it's pretty much like a one decade, a different generation can come along and with a very distinct sensibility, and that is subtle, nuanced, but also pretty pronounced in trades and in their qualities.
That's great, but I want to understand more about these new Chinese buyers. I mean, what kind of things they're looking for? Sure, it's fine. We're repeating it again.
In each sale, we will encounter new buyers. And I would say the buyers coming from two different groups.
I need to interrupt you, Xiaoming. I'm sorry if I misdirected you. I need to ask the question so that you can answer it. I mean, we just need to repeat that bit. So if you can wait for me to ask the question for a second. Okay, so that's great, but I want to understand more about these new buyers, these new Chinese buyers, and what kind of thing they're looking for. I mean, I assume that they're small but an influential and a confident group of people who are coming off from this enormous growth of new money. But is that a fallacy?
It's a very interesting question. So in each sale, we will encounter two groups of buyers and new buyers. One is coming from the corporations, and one is coming private new buyers coming to the market. So the corporations they want to form corporate collection. They all maybe perhaps the museum, building a museum. So in recent years, we are also seeing quite a few private museums were being built along the coast from Shandong and then to Guangzhou and also near Shanghai. And I recently encountered the two two younger people who are collectors, and one is educated from Cambridge University, is a sociologist major and also archaeologist. And so he wanted to form a museum that not just looking at art as the art, but from a very interesting point of view, leading the audience and creating new perspectives for to look at the artworks or looking at the material culture. And the other group, the other young person was building the museum based on the family reasons. The family, the father had a great wealth, and so expecting the son is doing well to the society. So the young person started building a museum, mostly collecting international new art. So we do see great international artworks from modern to contemporary coming to this market, and also coming to the museums. Especially you see Western art are being presented in the museums in Shanghai, like the Long Museum. So when looking at all these phenomena, one questions the motivation and the mission of the artists, the production itself, and also one questions the motivation and the missions for the from these private museums. Despite looking at the private museums are being built and also corporate museums, corporations are building museums, we also seeing the government have great intentions to build contemporary art museums with international art presented. One great event is coming this year on November the 6th, is the Chengdu Biennale. It is the largest biennale in China after the pandemic. And two municipal museums will also house this biennale, and it's a government organized biennale. In this biennale, and we have the organization team has several curatorial teams to look at various aspects on from various aspects to look at the current material production. And also they invited a great international artists to be in the show, from Anish Kapoor to other great architects as well. So we do see great artworks from Picasso to Van Gogh coming to the museums also in China. So with the museum showing, and many of the younger artists or younger collectors, especially the younger collectors, would like to collect art, not just the Chinese art, but also international art.
Okay, this is also very interesting. But now, as we don't have much time left, I want to do a final round, hopefully. And I want to understand what kind of a picture this all paints for us. Now, I want to turn to HG and ask you, HG, what is over the horizon for China's art market, do you think? I mean, what are some of the perhaps troubles ahead? People say censorship or the political tensions, sometimes the tax issues. Could be a challenge in continuing growth. What do you think? Do you feel hopeful about the future for Chinese art market?
Yeah, I'm hopeful in general about the future for all of the cultural scenes across Asia, including China. I mean, here in Hong Kong, next month, in 4 weeks' time, they're going to open the M+ Museum for Visual Culture, which is going to be a museum on the level of Tate Modern or MoMA in New York, but is going to be really focused on the history of modern and contemporary art and design and film. So it's going to be a new kind of museum that has an Asia focus. It's going to have be home to the SIG collection, which is the largest collection in the world of contemporary Chinese art, spanning the 70s, 80s, 90s through the 2000s. So that's finally got a home. So China, if you want to come see contemporary Chinese art, you'll be able to come to Hong Kong and see it alongside generational peers from Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, India, even the Middle East, as well as Europe and North America. So the future for not just China, but for Asia in general is more international. Like Art Basel Hong Kong is like the second biggest art fair, and every international gallery in the world that wants to be international has to have an office or a representative somewhere in Asia. I mean, it's just inevitable that everybody will continue to grow in the Asia Pacific region. And along with that, that just means that art scenes will continue to be more international. The younger artists will be more interconnected with their generational peers. More of them will move to places like Berlin, and end up showing alongside their generational peers, and maybe come back to China or come back to Korea, wherever. So the world is growing more interconnected, and these little blips that we see, like in terms of, yes, the trade war impacted the art market for a few years, but the momentum, I think, from Asia and from China is just so strong, and the demand and the interest is just growing. And these roots were laid decades ago, and it's finally really happening now.
Okay, thanks so much for this. Eugene, AG mentioned, he said that he thinks the future will be more international for Chinese art market. How does this tie into your idea of, master narrative that China needs to come up with, this new one? And are you hopeful about the future?
Yeah, I share very much what HG said about Asia being really a big player. And if you look at the whole history of the modern art and contemporary art, there was the shift from Paris to New York, and it will be interesting to see if indeed there's some kind of shift to Asia. Whether that happened or not, I'm not in a position at this to prophesy. But I certainly agree that Asia is going to be a huge player, and it's already impacting the world in terms of the aesthetic sensibility, the interesting anime, and all that. So that is happening. With regard to China, and I hope the policymakers and art world in China will keep this open outlook, and because that was crucial, and that was what got the Chinese contemporary art interesting in the first place. So I know there is a current some kind of inward turn, and also exalting the past, and or trying to revive traditional resources, and so that is a trend. To what extent that kind of mesh with contemporary art is a new challenge and new question, and because contemporary art does have its own complexion and fabric, and it has a certain look and quality, and to what extent the sort of turn to the past can also have a synergy with that turn to past with the contemporary art is something we would very much look forward to find out. But overall, I totally agree with what HJ, the kind of picture he offered. It's going to be a lot of things are going to be in Asia. The art world in Asia is going to be robust, and but finally, I have to say that also it will be interesting to see how the institution of art change, because for the past 2 decades of this century, actually, biennales and the curators essentially carried the show. It's no longer just the traditional art galleries. It's a lot of time is this kind of fanfare, the world fair, like biennales held in different cities. I know in Asia you would have Singapore, you have Hong Kong, you have, as
Sure.
Xiaoming said, Chengdu and all that. So that has been a sort of the how things run. But increasingly with digital technology and other medium emerging, and to what extent that still hold the ground is something we need to find out. Especially with this COVID, it has changed people's way of experiencing art. So are we still going to see some kind of another rounds and waves of biennales and so on? So it's something, it's going to be very interesting to find out. But overall, I think I'm optimistic sharing HG's enthusiasm, and that Asia certainly is the place to go.
Okay, well, it's a good note to end it with, I guess. Xiaoming, Zhang, Eugene, Wang, and HG Masters. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure talking to you about the interesting, the exciting world of Chinese art market. And thank you to all who've tuned in to watch this session.